There's a sort of jolly astonishment with which Mrs. Whitehouse diffidently accepts the status of a public person. Her career is only 9 years old, a career that's the same age as, and a reaction to, the so-called permissive society.
Last Thursday evening, we sat as a family, and it was the dirtiest programme.
She came to be seen as the avenging angel of Middle England.
It's beginning to dawn on people that they don't have to be passive about all this, and that every individual person can do something about it. This is the exciting thing that's happening. People are making money out of it. If you take pornography, it's a multi-million-pound industry.
We sell everything that makes people happy. We're in the happiness business.
She was creating hell in TV. Then she started on video and she caused havoc.
Mrs. Whitehouse occupied the position of Director of Private Prosecutions.
He said that Jesus Christ had practicing homosexual relationships with 15 of his disciples.
If you can keep being prosecuted for actions that aren't real, then the whole of theatre can be censored for impersonating policemen, for swearing, for singing a rude song in a public place.
I just wonder whether you're just jealous of the whole sort of modern permissive generation, and you sort of missed out on it yourself.
Oh, you really must be joking. You didn't know Mary.
Goodness, being Mr. Whitehouse, it must be sometimes difficult.
By the 1970s, Mary Whitehouse is enjoying the celebrity that her campaign is giving her. There she is on David Frost's show with Mick Jagger, showing off her dress. There's Mary Whitehouse, Serge Gainsbourg, and Jane Birkin. She looks visibly horrified at something that Mary Whitehouse is saying.
In a way, there's almost an element of her living up to her reputation. She would just churn out these reams of just absolute guff, complaining about everything.
Oh. That's not as big as my ball.
Dear Mrs. Whitehouse, we must refute the view that there was any talk about phallic symbols. The artist did not say, "That's almost as big as my balls." He did say, "That's almost as big as my ball." Oldenburg was referring to a ball in his sculpture.
Nice ball.
She complained about Alice Cooper's School's Out. You will hear the lyrics. School's been blown to pieces. No more books, no more teachers. She seems to take it quite literally, as if it's a call to arms for the youth to blow up their schools. The record shot to #1.
Mary Whitehouse was the best thing that ever happened to Alice Cooper.
And he sent her a bouquet of flowers to thank her.
By the mid-70s, as the ideas of the 60s counterculture kind of percolated through, there was a sense that perhaps censorship was something which was just an evil in all regards. And this was going to be a problem for Mary.
In her new book, Whatever Happened to Sex, published this week, Mrs. Whitehouse extends her attack beyond the media and argues that the permissive society threatens the whole basis of democracy in the West. It is quite a sensational title, isn't it? And the book is full of accounts of some of the most obscene sexual practices you could think of, which, of course, you quote in order to deplore them.
What I felt I had to do was bring in enough to make my case, indeed to shock people, without myself becoming pornographic.
Mary Whitehouse was a response to the sexual revolution. She saw it as a dangerous, dirty descent into sex. She talks and talks about sex, but never as a discourse about pleasure and who is entitled to have it.
On the West End stage, in shows like Come Into My Bed, Let's Get Laid, and Yes, We Have No Pyjamas, and in the pages of Britain's highest-selling magazine for men, Fiona Richmond campaigns for sexual liberation.
Well, my father was a vicar. And so I grew up in a huge, cold, draughty rectory in Norfolk. In 1970, I saw an advertisement in the Evening Standard which said swimmer wanted at the Whitehall Theatre. And I thought, ooh. So I went and I auditioned for Paul Raymond, took all my clothes off, I swam in this tiny little bath-like pool, and then he said I could have the job if I wanted it. That was the beginning of all the shows for Paul Raymond.
There's a lot of people all over the world that take the strongest exception to all sorts of things that people do. I mean, if I stood on my head and flung my knickers in the air, I'm sure Mary Whitehouse would go berserk about it, whereas other people might find it quite delightful.
How did you feel taking your clothes off?
Oh, it didn't bother. I didn't feel anything. I mean, I didn't understand why people made so much fuss. I was just an actress who did a lot of nude work. I didn't really ask, was it necessary for the plot for me to be naked here, which I know people do. I also used to write a column for a magazine called Men Only, which was supposed to be me going to all these different countries in the world and road testing men like other people road test cars.
And did you?
No.
What were you actually doing then?
Oh, nothing. Just getting pictures.
Actress Fiona Richmond, who toured the world and told an eager audience back home about her sexual adventures, is quite clear about her #1 dislike. She just can't stand Mary Whitehouse. Or, to be fair, she can't stand everything that Mary Whitehouse stands for.
I'm a great believer in not so much women's lib or men's lib or even gay lib, but in human liberation. And I don't see what right she has got to set herself up and say, this you must not see and this you must not read.
When Fiona talks about me banning anything, it's important that the viewers and everybody else realises I have no power to ban anything, Fiona.
Yes,
have I ever tried to stop you taking your clothes off?
I think you would if you could.
Mary Whitehouse had a large rant which covered absolutely anything if there was a boob in it. And she tried to sort of bully people, really, into behaving how she thought you should behave.
Do you not feel that the kind of people who are rather tolerant and, let's say, even if you're talking about sex at all, rather happy in their sex lives and so on, are not going to be impelled to protest?
Oh, but I think it depends what you think we're talking about. You talk about people who are happy in their sex life. So am I, and I've always been.
I think the thing about sex with Mary Whitehouse, I think she came at it with a kind of panic about the tumult and chaos of desire. And she knew about that.
Mary Whitehouse was born 69 years ago as Mary Hutchison, the second daughter of an agricultural feed salesman in Chester, and in 1932 got her first job as a teacher in a school near Wolverhampton. But the conventional start to what could have been an ordinary career was marked by personal crises in her early 20s, which seemed to have altered the course of her life.
You fell in love with a married man. And it would seem that was a turning point for you, really, in some ways. Was that right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I really was deeply in love with him.
She had an experience of this hurricane of desire that was dangerous, and I think she couldn't bear it.
I came to the point where I realised that even to have that kind of emotional feeling going out from me to a man who was himself married was wrong.
All we know is that it was a romantic association with a married man. To what level it was taken physically, no one knows, but it was enough for her to feel that something wrong had happened. And subsequently, she embraced the Oxford movement, which is this kind of quite fundamentalist Christian organisation.
She gets married, and we learn nothing about that marriage other than that it was very quiet.
You, in fact, Mrs. Whitehouse, want to go much further than just ridding ourselves of the worst of sexual excesses and pornography. You advocate chastity before marriage and fidelity within it, too.
Well, certainly.
Is it? Are you saying for women and men?
I can only speak as a woman. I can only say what I really believe, which is this, which is, first of all, to give yourself as a whole person fresh to the man that you marry.
What she embraces is a political agenda that protects women from that danger, the danger of desire, but lashes them to a kind of patriarchal dead zone, as if the dead zone is safe.
If you'd said to me in the mid-1970s, will pornography ever be legalised in England in your lifetime, I would have said there is zero chance it would ever be legalised.
David Sullivan's offices here were raided 4 months ago, and the group's appealing against a destruction order on the 72,000 magazines involved.
Nobody knew what the law was. The customers really wanted what we now think is hardcore pornography. I just pushed the barriers to find out where they were and try and give the customer as close as I could give him while staying out of prison.
Raids in London by Scotland Yard and similar police action in the provinces began to make inroads on profits. The publishers have been stepping over an ill-defined boundary.
The whole problem here is that the obscene publications legislation isn't effective enough to deal with a great deal of the pornography. I mean, what you have to do is prove a tendency to deprave and corrupt. You can't prove a tendency.
My guiding principle was that if consenting adults are doing a legal sex act and an adult wanted to buy it, well, why should Mary Whitehouse and her brigade say, you shouldn't see it? So we took her on head on and fought her.
As the porn industry became more and more visible, and this reflected the growing commercial power of porn, Mary was someone making a lot of noise to suggest that it should be closed down.
People are making money out of this. If you take pornography, it's a multi-million-pound industry.
As someone that had to be resisted, she was fastened upon by David Sullivan, now very well known as co-owner of West Ham.
His friends call him the General, his enemies the Reptile. David Sullivan is 33 and runs Britain's biggest porn empire. Now then, Mrs. Sullivan, would you say that Mrs. Whitehouse and you live in the same world?
No, I mean, Mrs. Whitehouse, unfortunately, I regard as a misguided old woman. And a very nice old lady. She says she's reasonable, she says she's a nice person, and this is why she is so dangerous.
Obviously, she was a threat at some level to his business because she was trying to insist on tighter regulation, and so he kind of took the fight to her. It was a guerrilla war with someone that was willing to fight as dirty as she was, even dirtier.
I launched a magazine called Whitehouse, and I got a girl called Maureen Muggins to change her name by default to Mary Whitehouse. And she used to go all around the country having sex with people, and I used to write her stories as Mary Whitehouse. And I thought it'd get me lots of publicity, so lots of magazines, which it did, in fact.
This would be one of our best-selling magazines on the softcore line. That's Whitehouse, and it's sold in newsagents throughout the country. Nothing too strong.
Shows pictures of the erect male penis, doesn't it?
Yes, but not actual penetration.
Not penetration.
Strength sells. I mean, when I launched Whitehouse, it was the strongest magazine in the country, and if you put in more explicit shots, they sold magazines without a shadow of a doubt.
The 70s was the Wild West of the sex industry. It was the first time I made any money. We were selling millions of magazines. Probably 1 in 2 men's magazines bought in England were mine.
Did it get you this?
It probably did get me this, yeah.
So I'm writing a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which looks at the harms that have come from the sexual revolution. You know, I don't want to present a simplistic narrative of this having all been to the bad. It absolutely hasn't been. But also I want to really undermine this idea of this having been unambiguously to women's benefit, because I don't think it has been. And that's how I ended up looking at Mary Whitehouse and sort of revisiting some of these events. people of my generation might occasionally joke about like being like Mary Whitehouse, meaning to be very authoritarian and repressive and so on. But actually, Mary Whitehouse was saying back in the 70s, back in the age when porn was just magazines, she was saying actually there are problems with this.
I've had letters from people which have touched me very deeply over this, where you have had men, husbands, who have the girly magazines and then the pornographic magazines, and then come back to their own wives and they want to try out on their wives' bodies some of the things, practices that they've seen. David, you can't begin to equate this with freedom. This is exploitation of the worst possible kind.
I think that what Mary Whitehouse predicted was that porn would have the effect of draining sexual relationships, of love and of intimacy. It's a sexual culture that is not interested in the welfare of the people who consume its product, right? It's interested in profit-making. And Mary Whitehouse was there at the very beginning when it was just starting to come into the mainstream, and she was one of the people who was drawing attention to its harms.
Has the change in attitudes to sex enriched people's sex lives?
David, I have a feeling, I don't know whether I'll be proved right or not, I may not live long enough to see, but I have a feeling that when we get to about the year 2000, say, and we can look back, I think that when we look back on the last couple of decades, because I think things are changing rapidly, that people will feel that far from having been a period of liberation and progress, it will in fact have been a thoroughly reactionary period of our history. I mean, the idea was that if one was absolutely open about sex and all this kind of thing, then it would all be put in proportion and it was but we've never been such a sex-obsessed society. We've had the permissive society long enough to see that it was a total illusion.
In spite of official snubs and personal insults, for the last 16 years, Mary Whitehouse has conducted a one-woman crusade to keep pornography and violence off the screen and out of the home. Mrs. Whitehouse has sacrificed her private life to her work. Neither she nor her husband enjoys the peaceful retirement they might have expected. I suppose a lot of people would think, goodness, being Mr. Whitehouse, it must be sometimes difficult, perhaps even embarrassing, having almost such a firebrand for a wife.
Well, I don't know that I say it would be embarrassing. It obviously has assigned to me, not exactly an inferior role, but I do prefer to take the background anyway.
And not embarrassed by all the talk of sex on television and violence and the rest of it, and her always declaring what she's shocked by and embarrassed by?
Not really, no. Yes, I feel somebody has to make a stand. In a way, I'm sorry that it's had to be a woman. But then, other women have had to do the same down the ages, haven't they?
I was 17 and I was doing A-levels at school, and the headmaster, who happened to be the owner of the school, asked to see me one day and he said, I've got an interesting project for you. How about a week's watching TV completely freely as you choose to do? You just don't get that offer, particularly in a boarding school. So I said, well, what's the catch? And the catch was, you'll need a little team. Here's a couple of things I'd love you to look out for. I'm interested to see the levels of violence. What's the nature of sexual content? What's the nature of the language that's used? What about blasphemy, the use of the name Jesus and use of God? So we watched from the news to close down. I only discovered afterwards that he was a very close friend of Mary Whitehouse and that he was a financial supporter of her organization. He passed on the content to Mrs. Whitehouse and published it under my name, calling it the Hastings Report. And there it was all over the newspapers of the day. And one of the things that Mary Whitehouse used to say all the time, when I eventually did meet her at 18, was if you change the language of a culture, that then allows society to become less human, less empathetic. I thought she was remarkable. I came to see her as a Boadicea kind of figure, saying to the nation, sit up and pay attention. I mean, we were just about to enter the multi-channel era. And she's kind of saying, are we happy with what we see now?
There was danger coming from Denmark in the late 70s. Jens Thorsen was a maverick performance artist / filmmaker who announced his intention to make a film about the sex life of Jesus Christ.
I remember people joking at the time, well, that'll be a 10-second film, if that, because what on earth are you going to say? He wasn't allowed to make that film in Denmark, but the UK was being liberal and open and progressive and, you know, the sexual revolution has happened and, well, come on in.
And of course, that aroused the moral panic. And Mary jumped on that bandwagon very cleverly.
Thorsen is an anarchist, and his film is intended as a weapon in the destructuring of Western society.
Mary Whitehouse's support comes from the National Viewers and Listeners Association, which she founded.
To be a moralist is to be a pariah in society today. But let us remember that freedom dies when moral anarchy takes over.
I think that our British society is based upon a kind of godliness. Our culture was based upon a Christian basis, so therefore we cannot ignore the blasphemy issue, which is clearly a biblical one.
Well, I thought this was emblematic of the degradation she talked about. Because if you do believe, as I believe, that Jesus was born as God, lived the clarity of purpose he did, to die for my sins and the sins of the world beyond, and to rise from the dead to bring life beyond, if I believe that, why do I want to abuse that name? You wouldn't abuse your mother's name. Why would you abuse the person who is your Saviour's name?
But what if you don't believe that? Haven't those people got a right to do that?
To abuse that name. What's the kind of strange thing? Would you still want those people to abuse your mother?
She wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury. She wrote to the Prime Minister.
And nothing seemed to be shaking the government of the day. So I thought, what can I do about this?
Why exactly did you write to the Queen about it?
I wrote to the Queen in her capacity as head of state and as defender of the Christian faith. And I wanted her to come out with a statement which would make it plain that this man was an undesirable in this country.
And lo and behold, about 10 days later, I receive a letter. While Her Majesty finds this proposal quite as obnoxious, I thought, ooh. So I did the smart thing. I rang up the BBC newsroom and I said, I have a letter from the Queen and it has an opinion. And not surprisingly, the Home Secretary had no option but to ban Mr. Thorsen.
In the end, I think he arrived in the country but then was dispatched pretty sharply. And this huge amount of momentum carried her forward to the next level, where she launched a series of legal actions which were the source of some of her great moments of triumph and also moments of absolute disaster.
Fulham, London, the offices of Gay News. 5 years ago, Dennis Lemon was one of the founders of Gay News. Since then, the paper's built up a circulation of some 20,000, providing a forum for news and comment about the homosexual world.
Hi, JC.
Hi. What had happened was Gay News had published a poem called The Love That Dares to Speak Its Name.
The poem was sent to him by a previous contributor to Gay News.
I thought that the message it contained was a powerful enough message to take people back, but not in the sense that Mrs. Whitehouse was taken aback by it.
I was actually 9, I think, when they published it and when I first read it. So it's called The Love That Dares to Speak Its Name by James Kirkup, and it's a description of a centurion taking the body of Christ down from the cross and then basically making love to the body. So it's not just homosexuality, it's necrophilia as well. As they took him from the cross, I, the centurion, took him in my arms. The tough, lean body of a man no longer young, beardless, breathless, but well hung.
From the moment the publication of this poem came to Mary Whitehouse's attention, the die was cast, there was going to be trouble.
Would you agree that he was trying to say, not very well, we would agree on that there is a place in the love of God for a depraved homosexual?
Well, let's look how he said that. He said that Jesus Christ had practicing homosexual relationships with 15 of his disciples.
Her theory was that because Christ is without sin, and because homosexuality is a sin, this magazine is blasphemous.
And it was only as I talked it over with my solicitor and with counsel that together we felt that there was indeed grounds here for action. As counsel said, if this isn't blasphemous, nothing ever would be.
It was bizarre because this was a blasphemy trial. The only textbook was the Bible. We hadn't had a blasphemy trial for a century. There was one in 1922.
What my father, Nicholas Walter, did when Gay News was being threatened with this prosecution, he announced that he would send out a copy of the poem to anyone who wanted it. He said, if anyone sends a stamped addressed envelope to the free speech movement but gave our home address, he would send a copy of the poem back in the stamped addressed envelope. And the police did visit our home a couple of times and he just dodged into the neighbour's garden.
He's aware that this is against the law. How does he justify it?
I'm not concerned with the law as regards publications. I think that publications should be circulated if people want to read them.
My father was an atheist, and he made atheism and anarchism kind of his life's work.
In the week of the trial, groups of Christians all over the country met and prayed.
This poem drags the name of our Lord in the dirt.
His argument with religion was really that it wasn't true, and people shouldn't follow stories just because they were nice and sweet and made them feel better.
Do you accept that books can be morally damaging?
I'm sure they can be. One of the most morally damaging books ever published is the Bible, and I certainly wouldn't want to prevent its circulation.
And I think he was also worried for those on trial about the idea that they might go to prison and the way that the state was going to be used to try and uphold religion against free expression, against literature, against poetry, against the imagination. And he saw a real threat from Mary Whitehouse.
No, I think it's a complete and absolute farce from beginning to end, except that somebody might get hurt.
Dennis Lemon, the editor of Gay News, was personally made responsible for its publication, and that's who the legal suit was against. And this became, obviously, an issue of freedom of gay expression. And looking at the postbag of the letters Mary received about this, the hatred is grim. There's a brutal homophobic, not even an edge.
It really was a crusade on her part to stop the promotion of homosexuality, to stop any respect for homosexuals.
Whitehouse! Out! 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 Gay persecution! Out!
Mary Whitehouse was allowed, and this was quite disgraceful, to have her supporters sit out in the corridor outside the court praying for a conviction. I had figured that the only way to succeed in this trial was to be holier than her. So I had read my Bible and I had interpreted it inclusively. In one of her many autobiographies, she wrote, "I shall never forget the dreadful sense of despair." Robertson talked about God's love for sinners and for homosexuals, who, like everyone else, must have the hope of salvation and redemption. The phrase, "the devil's advocate," took on a whole new meaning. I took that as a compliment, even though Mary, I'm sure, didn't mean it. In the end, the verdict was to convict.
She won the case, but there was an absolutely massive backlash.
The Gay News trial brought out a lot of people who started to stand up for gay people, either because they were themselves in the closet or because they were sympathetic to those who were and wanted to abolish the hostility to homosexuality that this woman and her supporters represented.
Do you not feel on reflection that your prosecution of the Gay News over that poem really was a rather disastrous error?
No. What you are now doing, if I may say so, you are caught up in the immense propaganda which was put out by the whole of the humanist gay lobby.
She was one of the original cancel culture figures, but her campaigns were, most of them in the end, counterproductive. And that's the danger of censorship campaigns. It's the danger of any cancel culture campaigns that you, in one way or another, your legacy turns out to be the very opposite of what you would wish.
The kind of country Mary Whitehouse thought was desirable was an explicitly Christian, a theocratic state. And in the latter stages of the 70s, this dream was realised, but not in the form Mary had imagined, not in Britain, the land of William Blake's Jerusalem, but in Iran. And obviously to claim that Mary Whitehouse was an influence on Ayatollah Khomeini would be ridiculous, because she wasn't. But what she had done was tap into an energy which has been very strong in driving tides of human affairs and which had been by and large forgotten about. And that was the idea that certain things, beliefs are held sacred by people, and that if you mess with that, there will be consequences. For Gay News, it was a fine of £1,000. But for Salman Rushdie, a few years later, it would be a large portion of the world's population bent on his destruction.
Michael Bogdanov was given encouragement by a small group of actors as he arrived at the Old Bailey this morning.
In what's considered an important test case in the field of obscenity in the theatre, the trial opened at the Old Bailey this morning of the director Michael Bogdanov. It concerns the national theatre play The Romans in Britain. Mrs. Mary Whitehouse has brought a private prosecution, alleging that Mr. Bogdanov procured the commission of an act of indecency in one of the scenes.
How do you feel? Was it obscene?
No, definitely not.
Well, there was only one 30-second incident of homosexual rape. There was some nudity, and everyone took it in their stride.
I have with me Mrs. Mary Whitehouse, who originally brought the first complaint against the Romans in Britain. Mrs. Whitehouse, why did you complain about the Romans in Britain when you haven't seen it?
Oh, I've got far too much respect for my own mind. I wouldn't dream of going to see it.
What happened was Mary's long-term conviction that she didn't actually have to see something to say it was wrong really bit her in the arse.
Mary's barrister decided that Michael could be prosecuted under a law which was used and only used to prosecute men who masturbated in public toilets. Mrs. Whitehouse's solicitor had been sent to see the play to get evidence for its prosecution. That he said he'd see the actor with the tip of his penis protruding below his tunic. We decided the witness should be asked to say where he was seated, and we couldn't believe it. He was sitting in the gods, in the very back of the theatre, 90 yards from the stage. He was asked, "Can you say with certainty that you saw the tip of the actor's penis?" And then the witness made the classic mistake of asking, "What else could it have been?" And Jeremy said, "It could be the tip of the actor's thumb." The witness said, I'm not sure. And that, of course, was the end of the case.
The thing that the theatre has to fight for is that contract that exists between the theatre and the spectators, that it is a pretence, that it's a trick, an illusion, and if you are acting, it is not real. And if you can keep being prosecuted for actions that aren't real, then the whole of theatre can be censored, not just for acts of gross indecency, but for impersonating policemen, for swearing, for singing a rude song in a public place, sedition, libel, anti-terrorism, etc., etc., etc.
It was an absolutely humiliating defeat. The case, she didn't just lose it collapsed, and that brought an end to her legal phase.
The thing is with radical social transformations is there is no progressive arc of the universe bending towards justice. What there is just conflict groups, you know, engaging and people winning and people losing. And this is what I think is so interesting about Mary Whitehouse, the fact that in some senses she is on the wrong side of history. I think it's very clear that she was genuinely homophobic. Her use of archaic blasphemy laws, very few people now would see that in a positive light. But also at the same time, Mary Whitehouse was one of the few people at that era who was taking child sexual abuse seriously.
On the extreme fringes of countercultural endeavour, there was a view held by outwardly respectable people that any form of sexual expression was fine, even if this involved children. And there was an organisation called the Paedophile Information Exchange, which functioned above ground and some people deemed to be an acceptable thing.
I would be all in favour of children finding their own way sexually, but I think also that adults have a part to play.
How can a child of 12 make a mature judgment about something like sex for the first time, which it has not the first idea about, and cannot possibly weigh the consequences of it?
A child is able to recognise a pleasurable experience. He is able to express consent and to recognise that this is something he wishes to continue. And a responsible, caring paedophile, it always refers to the wishes of the child.
There was some within the National Council for Civil Liberties who supported it, but Mary Whitehouse did not think it was acceptable and campaigned to reform laws to protect children from sexual exploitation.
I specialise in what's known as the Lolita market.
What is the Lolita market?
The Lolita market is a girl between 15 and 17.
Right. Now, what do you call the girls under 15 in your market?
I don't cater for anything under that age, but they are known in the international sex business as Muppets.
They go down to what age?
They go down to about 12.
And below 12, what do you call them there?
Any child below 12 is a nymphet.
Children of under 7 and less than 2 being indecently assaulted in the process of producing pornographic literature. Now, if that doesn't stir you, there's something wrong with all of us if we're not stirred to do something about that.
There was another huge petition, and the first real bit of legislation she helped with was the Protection of Children Act in 1978. There are things in that act that the fact that they weren't covered by law is absolutely stunning now. And it wouldn't have passed when it did without Mary Whitehouse's involvement.
Prime Minister.
One of the largest files that we have is all of the correspondence between Mary Whitehouse and Margaret Thatcher. I think Whitehouse saw a kindred soul in Thatcher. They both worked the housewife angle. They're both Christian housewives. And in the run-up to Thatcher's election, she really went with the morality of the country and bringing it back on track. And I think that really appealed to Whitehouse. Now, whether it was an election strategy on Thatcher's behalf to really mobilize the women, much like Whitehouse, and secure their votes.
Towards the end of the 70s, Mary Whitehouse's battle to turn back the tide of the permissive society saw her closer to the seat of actual power than anyone would have thought remotely conceivable when she began her campaigns. And with Margaret Thatcher's election victory in 1979, Mary Whitehouse thinks, right, I'm in.
For Mrs. Thatcher, it's cheers all the way as she goes walkabout in the West Country.
But all the economic indicators point one way. We're heading for a recession.
My father worked at a Jewish grocery shop in the East End for 28 years. When I left school, I went straight in there. But I didn't like the grocery business at all. It was horrible. And in 1978, 79, we'd heard about video. Well, I heard that people could watch what they wanted in their own home. And we thought maybe this is going to be something we need to be in.
Britain is in the forefront of the video revolution. We have more video recorders per person than any other country in the world.
79 and 80 was a lot of redundancies. And of course, people had their redundancy money and they were just chucking it into video, opening a little store somewhere, because it was a license to make money at that time. And what films did people want to see? The films they'd never seen before in their home. They wanted to see adult, they wanted to see horror. I used to take some home for the kids. They enjoyed the blood and gore. They wanted a fright. I didn't watch them because it wasn't my sort of thing.
What was your sort of thing?
Adult.
Video was the wrecking ball that went through everything to do with this whole censorship debate. Filmmakers realised that you could make very, very extreme stuff which did not appear to be covered by the existing legal framework. And there was an explosion of bizarre, gross-out films. And it gave Mrs. Whitehouse a new lease of life.
The British public don't know just how serious a threat, particularly to the young, the video nasties present.
It doesn't seem believable, yet every day this is what scores of Britain's schoolchildren are up to. They're tuning in their thousands to the sickening violence of an endless stream of video nasties.
You see a lot of blood. You see a lot of people getting their heads chopped off and slaughtered all over the place.
We are now facing electronic corruption on a gigantic scale. It's like a plague. And just as the locusts eat the green leaf, so most at risk in this plague are the virgin minds of the children.
Because of Mary Whitehouse, Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, decided that he'd get the police involved. There was a list which eventually, I think, was over 70 films which were deemed obscene. There's Cannibal Holocaust. That's cannibals, you know, people eating people. Well, the very famous Driller Killer. Well, it's an electric drill, and people are... The police started to raid video shops all over the country. And took a lot of stock.
Croydon magistrates have ordered the destruction of 234 cassettes of the video nasty I Spit on Your Grave.
Oh, it was chaos. I was thinking that if it carried on, they'd destroy the business totally, my business. And I might end up in prison. I mean, it could be up to 2 years.
The point about these films is, yes, they were disgusting, but the best of them were about power. They were about transgression. They were about madness. They were about nightmares and the nightmarish existence of violence in our society. And we are very naive indeed if we think that this is new. There was gratuitous horror on the London stage 400 years ago. Shakespeare wrote it all. Titus Andronicus is the first video nasty. The point of art and culture is that it's allowed to go to the edges. The point is it's wrong and evil, and we have found a way of imagining it.
I have never seen a video nasty. I wouldn't. I have far too much.
But how can you judge on a video nasty?
Oh,
I actually don't need to see visually what I know is in that film.
It seemed extremely unlikely that 40% of children from the age of 6 years old could have seen a video nasty. We've got something for you to do here. What we do is we made up film titles. What sort of film is it?
It's got a lot of blood in it.
Lot of blood. Now, when we gave that to school children, we found that 2/3 of them claimed they'd seen films which never exist.
But a moral panic suited everybody except the makers of the films themselves. It certainly suited the press because it was a great way of selling newspapers. And for the reactionary political right, the unlosable culture war of the 1980s was video nasties. It's not like unemployment, and it's not like inflation, a miners' strike. It's not like all these horrible, contentious things which might, in fact, result in political loss of face for the government. Video nasties was a glorious opportunity for them, and they took it.
Prime Minister sat with other MPs in the Commons today to show the government's support for the new bill to clamp down on so-called video nasties.
And the whole affair put Mrs. Whitehouse back in the driving seat.
I came to the BBC in 1984 as the controller of BBC One. At that time, Mary Whitehouse had started to build a political power base. And she was great copy. And if you're good copy, you get in the papers, and people take you seriously. I took the view that taking her seriously meant taking her on.
I don't know, you make a pretty good scrubber. Hey!
You've been with her, haven't you? All punched up.
There's teeth marks. You're a joke, you are.
EastEnders launched on my watch. Coronation Street up to that point, which was the #1 soap, was very cosy.
You've not pinched a pair of new grey socks of mine, have you?
And didn't tackle any of the social issues. EastEnders had race, divorce, sexual misconduct, bullying, everything was in EastEnders, and was a massive success. And this drove her mad because it was so popular.
This, my sweet, is a letter from my solicitor telling you that your husband has filed a petition for divorce.
We got 30 million viewers on Christmas night.
Happy Christmas, eh?
This was anathema to Mary, and it became a crusade, stop EastEnders. To Mr. Michael Grade, controller BBC One. This series is turning out to be one of the most sordid and depressing ever seen on television. The constant infidelity, promiscuity, lying and swearing makes it totally unsuitable for such a time slot. Social problems existed before television, but where there are intractable problems, governments always feel they have to be seen to be doing something, and they always reach for television.
Which brings me to what in future we may or may not be allowed to see and hear on our screens.
Mary wanted to bring broadcasting under the Obscene Publications Act so that people could bring prosecutions against programmes, and the courts would have to decide whether we would go to jail because it depraved and corrupted and so on. Well, this was madness. And when the first vote went through the House of Commons, I think second reading, I checked to see who had voted in favour. The blood drained from my face. Mrs. Thatcher had taken the trouble to go through the lobby and vote in favour.
The bill, now in its committee stage, comfortably passed its second reading on the 24th of January, with Mrs. Thatcher among its supporters.
This was a serious interference with freedom of expression. There would be injunctions on programmes, there would be endless prosecutions. I said, well, I'm going to run a campaign against it.
What is Mrs. Whitehouse's vision of television in this country? I don't know what it is exactly, but I can tell you what it isn't. And it isn't I, Claudius. It isn't Shakespeare's Lear. It isn't Oliver Twist. It isn't Nicholas Nickleby. And it certainly isn't Monty Python. We have to resist this bill at all costs.
The bill died eventually. She was so out of touch with the audience that she never had any hope
of succeeding, in my view.
The sort of gloss of respectable, Christian, old-fashioned, home-loving values that Margaret Thatcher projected, you know, Mary fell for that hook, line and sinker. And the reality of the situation became apparent that not only was Margaret Thatcher not going to do what Mary wanted, she was going to do a lot of things that were going to pretty much destroy the world as Mary knew it.
Every election, she would arrange for the National Viewers and Listeners Association to urge a vote for the Tories, even though their free marketeering was responsible for the massive growth of soft pornography.
This is the private shop at Forest Gate in East London. There's no shop window, but equally no doubt what's on sale.
I tried a few sex shops. They was probably all initially local, and then I went away from London. Because there was no licensing in those days, so that nobody could stop me opening anywhere.
From here, they've been sending out this letter to the editors of local papers around London. They've invited readers to say if they'd like a sex shop in their high street. Where reaction seems favourable, they're ready to find premises.
Well, I thought I'd get a lot of free publicity if I encouraged people to protest against me. Total madness. You'd be front page news. Sex shop opens in Wisbech in 6 weeks' time. So we got all this free publicity. I was open 62 in 1 year.
Conegate say that while Fleets and Albans and Enfield don't want them, the response from Woking, Guildford, Harlow, Basildon and Bedford has been favourable enough for them to go ahead.
What are you doing here at a Conservative Party conference?
We're having 2 fringe meetings a day, and what we're doing is calling on the government to fulfil the promise it made in its 1983 election manifesto, when it said, and I quote, it would respond to increasing public concern over pornography and bring in legislation to deal with it. Now, time's running out.
Gang Bang Orgy. Have you seen this? Have you seen Gang Bang Orgy?
Yes, I have, yes.
Do you think what these magazines do is to satisfy sexual appetite or to stimulate it?
I'd like to think they satisfy it. And I'm convinced that if a customer comes into my shop and buys a magazine, takes it home and masturbates, I would far sooner that happen than the people not be able to get the material and go out on the streets and cause a sexual crime.
In the 70s, rape in Britain went up by almost 40%, and these women are angry and frightened about it. Their fear is that as pornography and sex shops become increasingly accepted as part of the cultural scenery, society itself is becoming conditioned, if not to accept sexual violence, at least to regard it with a diminishing sense of outrage.
There are a lot of people around who are anxious to persuade you and me that sex and violence have no relation one with the other. I do not believe that.
The odd thing about Mary Whitehouse is that she's on the same territory as feminism. She recognises the expansion of sexual exploitation, pornography, men's entitlement to women's bodies. What she doesn't do with that is to challenge the patriarchal culture that produces pornography. What she does is to ally herself with the most conservative pillars of patriarchy.
On his way to the Royal Television Society convention, Mr. Hurd stopped for tea at home with Mary Whitehouse. The Clean Up television campaigner believes Mrs. Thatcher's government will stop pornography being beamed into Britain.
She has always, over the years, given us a great deal of support, and I'm quite sure her intentions are that this stuff shall be controlled.
Do you not acknowledge what you have in common with the feminist cause?
I was fighting for women's and children's rights long before the feminist cause, and I've never felt that because I'm a woman I haven't been allowed to do things.
But you call yourself a feminist, would you? Fighting for feminist causes?
No, I call myself a woman.
Mary Whitehouse, in some respect, is very like Margaret Thatcher. She loves power. She loves being close to power. She is not going to share it for 1 second with other women.
The letters start out quite warm.
Thatcher appears to really listen to Whitehouse. They get into the late 80s, they become shorter. Sometimes they're not even from Thatcher at all. They're from her private secretary. It might have been Whitehouse outlasted her usefulness. By the late 80s, sexual permissiveness and obscenity on television, it was a lost battle. She was to retire in '93, and, you know, by then, the NVLA perhaps ceased to be relevant.
The preconditions for Mary Whitehouse to exist, you have to have a centralised authority which is responsible for what people can see. And obviously there is no such authority in any meaningful sense anymore since the advent of the internet. You know, the horse hasn't just bolted, it's run around the town and been hit by a butcher's truck, as far as Mary's concerned.
What I feel about my father's generation generally is that they had a real idealism that if you remove constraints on people's behaviour, you will get to not only a freer, but also a better, kinder, fairer society. And I feel that that kind of idealism, I question that. I wrote the book Living Dolls. Part of the book is about the pressures on young women in terms of living in this very hypersexual culture. What I was really struck by when I was doing the research for that book was how the entry of pornography into the mainstream is so harmful for young people and for women, and the kind of threats it poses often to their freedoms. Although I don't come at it from the same angle as Mary Whitehouse, there may be an area in which there is meeting of minds now.
Mary Whitehouse had a, dare I say, a kind of prophetic foresight. What she was saying in a non-social media era, in a very limited media era, was be careful, be cautious, because these things come to control you. They come to define the character of the next generation.
So was she right?
Of course she was right.
One crude way of understanding the sort of political correctness of our era, you hear sometimes people describing it as being almost like Mary Whitehouse, you know, cracking down on like inappropriate jokes and things like that on the TV, even though, of course, Mary Whitehouse did not share the values of the people now who were trying to crack down. I sort of think in a way it shows that it actually isn't really possible to have a society without speech codes. Like, every society does have a form of blasphemy. They might not call it blasphemy, and it might not necessarily have a religious basis. What we did is we tried to get rid of the old blasphemy laws and do away with all of the old conventions, and actually we ended up putting new ones in their place, just different ones. And so in a way, you can kind of offer this like revisionist history of Mary Whitehouse, where actually she was the winner all along.
Now, the impulse to censor has migrated to social media, to Twitter, where there's another form of outrage, another form of righteousness, another form of people who want to censor because they think that it is the right thing to do. But so did Mary Whitehouse. We're living in a post-permissive, post-debate society where she has sort of won and lost at the same time. It saddens me because anything that reduces the possibility of people talking to each other saddens me.
There were admirable things about Mary Whitehouse. At that time, women of a certain age, you know, they had to look after the grandchildren. They weren't expected to be vocal, and she certainly was. She challenged people who sometimes were so toffee-nosed that they deserved to be challenged. And she was exercising her own freedom of speech.